scene from Bram Stoker's Dracula. Yes, I know it has Keanu Reeves in it, which makes it gothic all by itself. But yeah, it's basically, it has the man going to the wilderness.
I didn't hear you come in.
But then,
how do you catch yourself? It is more dangerous than you think.
we see here the traditional Gothic, except in that context, it then takes the story actually back to the city and places it there instead of in the old abbey or castle or what have you in the wilderness. Questions? Comment, yes.
Probably one of the best examples of a modern novel that actually is a remake of Frankenstein is Dean Koontz's books, the whole Frankenstein series, because that's very much the Gothic romance. Yeah, and if you really read the book, there are many components of it that could certainly be considered steampunk as well, even though that it's not a steampunk novel. There are certain elements in it that could easily translate to steampunk.
That is a very good point. There's a lot of works that aren't steampunk in the traditional sense, but yet have that same sensibility that draws to these root works. I mean, let's say William Faulkner, his entire category of works is Southern Gothic, as an example. So you have that Gothic sense, and you can still draw it into the steampunk worldview. Now, we go to, of course, the two gentlemen that everyone selects as the forefathers of steampunk, with good reason. Jules Verne and H.G. Wells. Now, scientific romances are the most direct antecedents of what we call steampunk, because they wrote using the high-level Victorian technologies. You have your mechanical creatures, you have your high science of the late 19th century. They were writing science fiction for their day, but we call it steampunk because we look at it from the context of our own experiences. Our own experiences, basically taking those stories and writing them again. And Jules Verne actually was an interesting gentleman in that he didn't say that he was writing speculative fiction. He said he was writing adventure stories. And he actually focuses on what is good and optimistic about the human condition. If you read, for example, Around the World in 80 Days, Phileas Fogg basically is a steampunk hero in that he's a very mechanistic thinker. He's very focused on logic. Howard Hendricks calls him a Newtonian Laplacian man. And it's like he focuses solely on the mechanical, logical thoughts of a steampunk hero. Now, Wells, on the other hand, actually talked more about the darkness in the human experience. The time machine discussed what would happen after the end of this massive war, the separation in the societies between the Eloi and the Morlocks. That was a very interesting focus that you can place in the roots of steampunk just from the science behind it and from the attitudes of it. Now, Verne doesn't use technology Verne uses technology in a different way, as an end goal. Wells comments on technology. He comments on its importance to society, basically on what it actually ends up meaning to people. also have, again, I talked about Captain Nemo before as a Byronic hero in the Gothic tradition. He also falls under what Mike Pershon calls the rebel and the mad scientist. Those two character types in steampunk, they're so important to the genre because, of course, the word punk means rebellion. It's a rebellion against the status quo. So when you have a rebel, he's an important part of the pantheon of characters. And the mad scientist is the steampunk because you have the scientist in Frankenstein, you have the scientists in the Order of the Brass Octopus in Gail Carriger's Parasol Protectorate. They classify under the mad scientist umbrella because of their experiments on the supernatural denizens of Britain in the Soulless novel. So there's that. The entire, let's see, I'm also skimming through my paper as I talk. And then another thing you have is you have the island of Dr. Moreau. Dr. Moreau is an interesting mad scientist because he believes that what he's doing is right. This is what he should be doing. This is the only path that he needs to take. And this is contrary to, this is a mad scientist. It's also contrary to what is seen as proper scientific thought. And it's this kind of insanity, in other words. So, is it gonna do it again? We'll find out. This is from I think this is from the Val Kilmer edition of the movie The Island of Dr. Moreau. So, this story actually came about because during the time that Wells was writing this, there was a lot of anti-vivisection movements going on in Britain. Vivisection, if you don't know what it means, it's basically killing animals and cutting them up for anatomical study. And there's some fairly gruesome pictures online, which I haven't saved. Be happy. Gonna skip to the next one. And basically with this, you have the steampunk, you have the mad scientist. Nemo's a mad scientist, but he's a mad scientist with, you could call it a more noble purpose. And this Dr. Moreau is a mad scientist in terms of just wanting to do this for scientific inquiry. He vivisects all of these animals and meshes them with humans. It's also an early form of genetic experimentation that you see later. Excuse me. Now we go, of course, to Verne and 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Now, this is classic. This is a classic steampunk just because of the level of technology. Because of the level of technology that's in it. It's a highly advanced submarine technology, highly advanced diving technology, existing in the Victorian period, which is not something that you saw in average fiction of the day.
And now the conclusion.
Didn't want that. Okay. Questions? So I'm sure I'm going through these fairly fast. No? No? Okay. is going to go in the anthology that Gypsy's putting together. If you guys are interested in picking that up at all, I'm not saying you have to, just putting it out there. Now, the technology and scientific romance is an important part of steampunk because that's where you get all of your advanced mechanical machines from. However, perhaps the most important thing is alternate history. Steampunk at its very core, when you set it on our world, on Earth, is an alternate history. It didn't happen that way. So you have to change the historical record in order for it to work, in order for this technology to exist. William Gibson and Bruce Sterling in The Difference Engine, they basically said that Lord Byron didn't die in the Greek War of Independence. Charles Babbage's Difference Engine was created in the 1820s. This litany of counterfactual things that did actually happen, that didn't happen in our record, but they did happen in the story of the Difference Engine because they needed to for the story to work. The earliest one, this was written by Louis Geoffroy, a Frenchman. It was a story called History of the Universal Monarchy, Napoleon and the Conquest of the World, 1812 to 1832. It's written basically assuming that Napoleon won in his conquest of Europe. He invaded Russia and didn't get kicked out by the Russian winter. He won at Waterloo. He didn't lose to the Duke of Wellington. And it's the history of saying all these things actually happened. Now, the alternate history is also an interesting story because as with scientific romance, there's two sides of it. There's the paradise scenario and the nightmare scenario. The nightmare scenario is basically saying, oh, look at how awesome our time frame, look at how awesome our times are. You know, this is how it could have gone so terribly, terribly wrong. And the paradise scenario is obviously the exact, well, I wanted it to happen this way, this is how I think it would have looked. The nightmare is actually pretty well done in Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1845 short story, Pease Correspondence. It basically talks about an alternate 1845 where all of these artists who died young, Lord Byron, Percy Shelley, all of these men are still alive. But the difference is they're alive and their work sucks. They've had much longer lives, but it's an example is Lord Byron is taking his story Don Juan, which caused a very big stir in the Romantic period, and he's taking out all of the saucy bits. In other words, kind of expurgating the text based on the fact that now in 1845, as an old man, George Gordon has found religion, for lack of a better way to describe it. And he's become a hyper-conservative and is taking everything out of his earlier hot-blooded works because it doesn't fit in with his worldview now. And the nightmare in Pease Correspondence is this, basically your best work is behind you. So it's better, according to Hawthorne, to die young in the prime of your life when you've already done some really good work than stay old, than age and watch your talent escape you.